never used one of these before. So, my name is Jerry Salta. I'm head of the education committee for NPL. It's a fairly large group, lots of wonderful people. Everybody's attached to separate projects. Everyone's working. Everyone's staying busy. It's always impressive, like every day, just to see how much effort, just hours and time that folks are putting in. Everyone's really busy, but they're still making time for this. I just want to go over a few of the projects that we're currently working on. One of them you'll see today, which is the teaching. We have a basic group that will be, these are beasts, so if we can get some volunteers to work on the next one, we would love that. This was a task. But we're working on teachings. We have this one we're going to present to you today. The next one will be on Black Power in Palestine for February. And then after that, we have a few more on the list that we'll decide once we get there. We're also working on FAQ sheets, which is, I think most of y'all have grabbed some from the front. We work with that directly with comms team. Sarah does all the lovely designing and printing on this amazing paper that makes us really fancy. We also have a resource library with Sabina is our project lead on, and we've done wonderful work. Hopefully y'all can take a look at the library. If you're ever interested, we have a plethora of books, PDFs, a lot of free material that y'all can access and read more. And then finally, we have a study circle today. That is currently a sort of internal process, so if you're working within one of the committees, you have been invited. If you have not, please reach out to us and we'll let you know what's going on. The only reason for that is it's a little bit small right now. We're trying to study circle a little more intimate. It's kind of hard to open that up to 100 people. And that's right now, we're working on that. And then last but not least, two more. We have a research team, which is led by Michael, and they sort of bleed into everything that we do. And then we have our zine and newsletter team, which I think anybody who's been to our direct actions recently has probably seen a newsletter from us, usually talking about something topical going on in the news and just giving people information. With that said, we're going to jump to the teaching. This will be a primer on Palestine. It is not a hyper in-depth discussion about the million things that we could get really detailed into. We're trying to give you guys a primer and then open it up for questions and have a dialogue at the end of this. Without further ado, on Palestine.
So in this teach-in, we're going to be exploring the Palestinian experience. We're going to debunk common misconceptions, and we'll briefly cover historical context to understand and counter Zionist talking points. We'll also discuss the harsh realities of living under military occupation, highlighting the dehumanizing effects and challenging the belief that military occupations bring security or peace. Learning about Palestinian history requires personal accountability and reflection, so I ask everyone to challenge the ingrained saviorism ideology, which is a mindset rooted in colonial histories, and it perpetrates stereotypes and undermines the oppressed. When taking in all of this information, remember that normalization is not the goal. It's tempting to think of these situations as things that just happen. We've been told that forever, especially when it comes to the Middle East, but we'll learn the long historical abuses in the region aren't a reason to justify or accept it today or ever. None of this is normal. None of this is justifiable, and it's essential to stay vigilant and not get desensitized. We will be welcoming questions throughout the presentation. We just ask that you go to onlinequestions.org, so onlinequestions.org throughout the presentation, and type in the code 89115. That is the zip code here, 89115. And you can submit questions, and we can vote on the questions to see which ones we all have that are similar. I don't know if there's a QR code for that, maybe not, but yeah, without, oh, it's up there, yeah, sorry. Okay. There's no QR code, but it does say online questions that were done up there. So without further ado, I will pass it on to our next presenter. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Okay, so let's get started on the origins of the liberation movement, which starts with Palestine, of course. It has a rich cultural history with many legs to stand on, such as farmlands, holy sites, there's agriculture, and appreciation for education, all of which are currently and have been under Zionist threat. And this threat reared its head at the turn of the 1900s, while Palestine was navigating the fall of the Ottoman Empire. So this was during World War I. Palestine was dealing with active military campaigns on their land, evacuations, conscriptions into the war. And during all of this, Palestine was still progressing in many aspects despite these hardships. Print was growing, writers were exploring ideas about social organization, challenging women's roles, working class, and education was expanding through a growing network of state schools. Most people were farmers, though, as the land of Palestine has rich agriculture, and at this point in history, farmers were acclimating to the exportation of goods. They were remaining versatile, so this idea that Israel came in and saved Palestine is false. Palestinians were saving themselves. They were surviving, acclimating. Citizens had identities based on family. And we see this value is still held today as many Palestinians can trace back their lineage and share family stories from generations past. There's also identities based on village or city of origin and or religious affiliations. And although there was a Muslim majority indigenous population, there were still other faiths. So Christians, Jews, and Muslims were all neighbors in Palestinian cities and shared cultural similarities such as speaking Arabic. This was during about the first decade of the 1900s, because by the end of World War I, Arabs found themselves under European occupation. And on November 2nd, 1917, the Balfour Declaration was announced. This called for the establishment of a national home for Jewish people in Palestine, pushing the Zionist agenda.
Can we get some claps, please? Okay, so we're going to talk about Zionism. The most important thing to know about Zionism is that it's not part of a religion per se. It's a political ideology, and it began in Europe. This political ideology pushes for a Jewish state through settler colonialism, basically grabbing land by force and kicking out non-settler populations through violent displacement, ethnic cleansing, and military occupation. Just like well-funded political ideologies have been pushed in the US to steal land or prevent human rights under the illusion of being a religious moral thing, Zionism falls under the same category, and it's one of the deadliest political ideologies that we've seen play out. Zionist banks fund organizations like the Palestine Jewish Colonization Association and Jewish Agency Colonization Department. These were historic organizations that helped bring the Jewish settlers to Palestine. And in the United States, the American Zionist Committee for Public Affairs, which we now know as AIPAC, they've renamed that. So there's funding behind this as well. Finally, as Zionism isn't necessarily a part of Judaism, it's important to recognize a political mission that's protected under a religious context. It's similar to how Manifest Destiny justified US colonization, only the idea behind that was to spread Christianity, to civilize people. It's awful to say. But Zionism aims for one state, one ethnicity, one religion, and not to spread Judaism. They are not welcoming Palestinians who want to convert to Judaism. It's not the same type of situation. So there's that differentiation. And it is something that many Orthodox Jews are opposed to as well. Let me see if I'm missing anything here. I don't think so. Okay, that's everything on Zionism that I have.
So, after the Balfour Declaration in 1917, we really see the colonial project take off and Jewish migration increase to Palestine. So in the 20s, the British mandate took all unclaimed properties neglected or owned by the government and gave them to the Zionist movement to build settlements. The British presence helped pave the way for the realization of the Zionist dream in Israel. Under the British mandate, the number of Jews is estimated to have multiplied 10 times to 500,000. And Hitler's rise in 1933 further prompted massive European Jewish immigration into Palestine, establishing more Jews-only settlements and military forts. So throughout this period, we see Palestinians being left out of the conversation in decision-making spaces, while Zionists took more and more land, gentrifying and segregating Palestine. The British continuously used violence to suppress Arab resistance. However, in 1936, the British ratified the White Paper, which rejected the partitioning of Palestine and called for the establishment of a Palestinian state. Zionists immediately rejected the White Paper and led a campaign of attacks on government property in response. So Zionist militia literally terrorized the British and other forces in the area to increase pressure for supporting a Jewish state. After World War II, the British voted to establish a Jewish state in Palestine and handed the Palestine problem to the new UN, which proposed to partition Palestine into 2 independent states, one Palestinian and one Jewish Israel state. The same Zionist militia that committed acts of terrorism to pressure the decision became the first Israeli government officials. The foundation of Israel is terrorism. In 1948, the same day the British Mandate of Palestine expired, David Ben-Gurion pronounced the Israel Declaration of Independence, therefore unilaterally decreeing the state of Israel. This is the day of the Nakba. This is where we see Zionist ideology manifest legally and where the state of Israel becomes naturalized into the world stage, backed by and financially supported by Western powers like the US and Britain and others.
Alright. Sorry. So honestly, this is a really pretty picture. And
Right?
we had to put a quote on it. So I'm going to read the quote again. It's a little small. So this is a quote by somebody that if you've ever been to my house, you'll see about 42 images of him sort of pasted around my walls. The quote by Hassan Kanafani. The quote is, "The Palestinian cause is not a cause for Palestinians only, but a cause for every revolutionary, wherever he is, as a cause of the exploited and oppressed masses in our era." This is from his book, 1936 to 39, Revolt of Palestine. It's actually a free PDF. It's in our library. If you'd like to read it, you can access it. We can go to the next book. So anybody who's ever sort of pondered about Palestine or looked into the Palestine question has heard the term Nakba. It quite literally means catastrophe in Arabic. I'm going to read the definition to you, or the definition that I sort of came up with. It's the operation of ethnic cleansing with the intent of expelling all Palestinians from Palestine to replace Palestine with a Jewish state. So from a historical context, this began in 1947. It truly began earlier. Obviously, nothing happens in a day. Right? It goes back to Balfour. But when people refer to it in historical context, it's 1947. There was 300,000 Palestinians displaced. This obviously put a lot of pressure on Arab neighboring states, and war broke out. War breaks out between the Zionist forces, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. And then obviously Palestinian militias were already present at that time. The Arabs suffer heavy defeats. They end up losing 80% of the Palestinian territory. Within that, 80% of the population within that territory is now expelled. And most of the Palestinians' urban population become refugees, and they become refugees in places like Yarmouk in Syria, and Jordan, Egypt, all over the Arab world, Lebanon. The numbers of it at the end were 800,000 were killed. 800,000 were ethnically cleansed and displaced from their homes. 500 villages were depopulated and destroyed. 80% of the land was seized. 70 plus massacres occurred, and 15,000 were dead. Let's move into the aftermath. So the Palestinian territories are reduced to the Gaza Strip under Egypt's control. The West Bank is given to Jordan, and including East Jerusalem. Israel now controls 80% of Palestine, and massive expulsion of Palestinian leads to instability in other countries. Within the 48 borders, if you ever talk to Palestinians, you'll hear them refer to the 48, or within 48. So that's basically this 80% that we're talking about. That was the initial graphic. So within those borders, the 20% of the population that's left, the Palestinians, are basically under martial law for decades to come. Like quite literally in ghettos, barbed wire, under lock and key. The most critical, we can go to the next slide. I think the most critical thing I want you to get out of these 3 slides is the Nakba is not a historical event. It is a continuous action. It has never ended. It's continuing today. If these numbers were jarring, the numbers today are worse. We have 2.4 million people internally displaced. We have 24,000 killed, 7,000 underneath rubble, which are missing. So over 30,000 people killed. 70% of whom are women and children. The Nakba continues. It will not end. It won't end until we stop it or they win. So that's really the context of this here. Okay? You can go on next one.
You don't want to talk about
About what? Oh, jeez. Oh. This photo, I'm sorry, I got caught up in the sauce. So this beautiful photo is Ammo. Ammo means uncle. So Abu Michael's birth certificate from Jerusalem, pre-1948. And if you actually read it, it says Palestine. So for the personal context there, we have somebody here that has a father that has a birth certificate from Palestine.
Okay, so the next few slides have a lot of history, so just bear with me. I think the most important thing that I'm trying to contextualize is that there was a lot of political context happening that led up to the first Intifada, which I feel like is often made to seem like Palestinians just wanted to, revolt. But obviously that's not true. So in this first period, major event that happened was the 6-Day War, which basically was just a war that broke out between Israel and a coalition of Arab states after Israel launched an attack in Egypt. In those 6 days, the Israeli ground forces conquered the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. And as an important note, President Johnson secretly authorized a supply of arms to Israel by air a few months, January, February, March, April, May, June. Yeah, the month before they actually attacked. And so we see like a very similar parallel to today where President Biden is like going over Congress's approval and just sending billions of dollars to fund the genocide in Gaza. Importantly, later on in September of that year, the coalition of Arab states in the Arab Summit basically put out this statement saying that they were united, they would not recognize Israel, and they were standing behind Palestinian folks' liberation. And so 3 kind of important points in terms of the significance of this event is that the Israeli military occupation of Gaza and the West Bank forms the current status quo, what we see today. Also, the war resulted in the expansion and economic revival of Israel. And then we also see kind of a power transfer from the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, to Fedayeen groups, which will be significant later on as well. And then I guess just sort of as a present day parallel, if things keep getting worse, etc., as they've done before, for example, in this war, many others that we'll cover, Israel will attempt to continuously redraw its borders and continue expanding, which is its whole MO. Can you move on? Okay, so lots happened here. So in this period, after the 67 war, we see a lot of kind of wars and events happening due to the kind of political context in surrounding neighboring countries, where there was a huge influx of Palestinian refugees because they were, being displaced. And so first kind of major thing I wanted to touch on was Black September in 1970, where Jordanian forces attacked Palestinian guerrilla fighter groups, and it kind of resulted in the end of Palestinian influence in Jordan and a change to the resistance movement itself. I think notably here, during this war, again, Nixon and Kissinger's support for it allowed Israel to fully mobilize. And so again, we see like the backing that's still happening today has always been happening. We move on then 5 years later to the Lebanese Civil War, where war broke out between divided Lebanese support for the PLO that was operating out of the country. Again, a lot of the resistance movement in terms of like the PLO and guerrilla fighter groups bled into surrounding countries. And so at the end of the war, or I guess as a consequence of it, it basically destroying the Palestinian Liberation Organization was the main goal of Israel and its military wing in the northern border. And the IDF invasion was the single most violent incident of the war, where there were 17,000 deaths and 30,000 wounded. And then on March 26, 1979, Israel withdrew from the Sinai Peninsula. And then we have the Sabra Shatila massacre, which Jarius will quickly explain.
So the Lebanese Civil War began in 1975. It was over by 1990. The PLO was out of it by 1982. There was internal strife within Lebanon on top of the Palestinian issue with Israel on the northern border. So the PLO was essentially, Israel would not leave until the PLO was ceased to exist. They held out for weeks. They fought, can't curse. They fought valiantly. They did really well. They did better than people thought they were going to do. And a big part of the reason why they were holding out was because they were worried about the Palestinian civilians. They knew that they were the protectors. They were their army, they were the police, they defended them. So a part of the negotiation was, we're going to keep holding out, we're going to keep fighting until you give us guarantees that they are protected. We won't leave the camps unguarded. There were guarantees. They pulled out in early September. International soldiers pulled in to basically create a buffer. 2 days after those international soldiers left, phalanges groups pulled in underneath the watch of Ariel Sharon, the future PM of Israel, who's a general at the time, and they massacred 3,500 women and children. The fighters were long gone. There was no fighters left in the camp. They sort of used the excuse of 2,000 fighters in the camp, per usual now. It's the same stories you see today, right? They went to El Shifa Hospital because there was some attachment to Hamas, right? Nothing. No evidence. It's been debunked 20 times. It's over. These sort of stories repeat themselves as you get to really start digging in, right? This is their MO. It's just now we have the power of this, the power of social media that's all being exposed. But yeah, that's the sort of Southern Shatila. There was no fighters in the camp. Did I do something? I did. Oh boy. I did a lot of things. I don't think one of these buttons is gonna fix that.
Intermission, guys.
Think about Southern Shatila for a second. There was actually a camp. We can talk about a little more in depth since we have a second. So, like I said, the fighters basically, the political groups, the militant groups were fighting out of camps. They defended the camps. Specifically, that camp was defended by a group called the PFLP. It's a little bit of a personal story because I have family members that were in that camp, that were fighting out of that camp. And 2 weeks after they pulled out of that camp and ended up in Syria, the report came out of the 3,500 massacre. We can continue on, I think, now. Are we good? And then it's you again, yeah?
Yeah.
First Intifada?
Yeah.
I think so.
Julius, point it this way.
Sorry if I'm pointing at you. And I think we're good. I'm gonna put that down.
Yeah. Okay, and so all of that, right, is the context that I was explaining before that kind of leads to the first Intifada. Intifada as a word means uprising or shaking off, and started on December 8th, 1987. Broadly, it was, this is like a very large broadly, was a conservative people's movement that sought Palestinian sovereignty, basically. So in terms of what was actually happening, what people were doing, taxes such as strikes, boycotts, withholding taxes, and other forms of civil disobedience were used, given that Palestinians were a very large part of the Israeli economy. And we kind of see a parallel to today, just in a kind of a different way. International boycotting from us, folks in the imperial core, like the US, Western Europe, whose governments and corporations give out, billions of dollars in support, hence the general strike going on right now, hence other things that have happened, which is, in a different context, because obviously during the first Intifada, Palestinians themselves were the ones that were doing the strikes, boycotting, etc. And in terms of the bigger significance, I guess, of the first Intifada, brought international attention to the situation of Palestinians in under Israeli occupation. We'll also say that, again, I really want to underline this point. There were sustained protests that broke out in response to 20 years of occupation in the West Bank and Gaza, so again, didn't just come from anywhere. And of course, as we could predict, their response tactics were very violent on behalf of Israel. In 1988, the Minister of Defense issued a, quote, bone-crushing policy instructing the Israeli occupation forces to restore order by any means necessary, which, again, with a theme of kind of like history of the circle, we see happening right now in Gaza as well. And notably, too, the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas, is formed shortly after the start of the Intifada. And in terms of total casualties, there were around 1,962 Palestinians killed and 200 Israelis killed. I kind of also want to underline the difference that you might be seeing in the numbers that we're sharing. Which I think speaks to the funding and the kind of support, military armor, etc., that one side has versus the other, which I think is commonly glossed over in the larger context of this. One side has an Iron Dome, another doesn't. So just something to think about or keep in mind throughout this whole history. But yeah.
All right. Sorry, one second. So basically, the first Intifada ends. It ends, and we basically walk right into Oslo. I think most people have heard about Oslo. It was an agreement between Fatah, which was the largest political group, and it was the largest political group within the PLO. The PLO was a parliamentary group, so there was multiple political parties within it. Fatah was the majority. It was an agreement between Fatah and Israel, where Fatah would essentially recognize Israel. In exchange, Israel and the U.S. would allow them to become the Palestinian Authority. At this point, Fatah was in exile. They were living in Tunisia. This was right after the civil war in Lebanon ended, and they were expelled. They were hiding out in Tunisia. They were they're dead. I mean, they're nothing anymore. And nobody recognized them as any sort of authority on Palestine. They were just there. So they sort of made a deal with the devil. They wanted the power, they wanted the authority. They said they would recognize Israel as long as they were given the authority to rule over and govern over the Palestinians. The critical things out of Oslo, it's not very important. It set the stage for a lot of bullshit. But it's not important as in the court itself. Israel was really intelligent by doing this. It gave them political cover. They could sort of get under the guise of negotiations for the next 15 years. You know, we're negotiating. We're trying our best to make it two-state. None of the details were worked out when these accords were signed. None of the actual major sticking points, the settlements, the settlers. What are you going to do with all this? How are we actually going to have this border drawn? What are we going to do with East Jerusalem? It was literally said, let's just get something on paper. We shake hands, and we'll figure that out over the next 12 years. Brilliant move if you want to continue building settlements and have the international world sort of look at you as like, oh yeah, you're trying, that's good. If anything, it got worse. Actually, I can do this now, right? By the end of 2000.
This way.
That's right, sorry. There again. As Oslo as the sort of Oslo era is exposed, and just to get into this, there was hope. Like, Palestinians living on the ground did have hope that this would turn into a state. This wasn't immediately. Edward Said, brilliant, recognized it as sort of false. That this it's BS. This isn't real. This isn't going to lead to anything. But there was hope on the ground. So by the year 2000, when you're living in Palestine, the West Bank, and you see 200,000 settlers in your backyard, and then within 7 years of the Oslo Accords being signed, you have 400,000 settlers. You quickly realize this is going nowhere. The situation is getting worse. The screws are being tightened on you. You don't have a lot of options. There was tensions between Palestinians and Israel already. Things were rising, and then the final thing that Sharon did, he was the prime minister at the time. He entered into the Al-Aqsa Mosque with armed soldiers and basically desecrated the mosque, which there was an immediate response. And the response led into an intifada that would go from the year 2000 to 2005. It was a violent intifada. The Israelis spent over 1.3 million rounds of ammunition. They killed 5,000 Palestinians. They injured over 10,000 children. Arafat had offered peace at one point, trying to end it. They quickly rejected his peace offer. And the critical thing of the whole thing, really, is this is where we see the apartheid wall coming into play, right? This was sort of the justification for building that wall, creating more checkpoints, and really just ramping up the apartheid state. And it came from this intifada. Can do it this time. All right. So this is a big jump, I know, from 2005 to 2021. A lot of things do happen in that time. There was an election. You see the split we have now, where Hamas is ruling over Gaza, or governing Gaza, and Fatah is ruling over the West Bank. But just for the sake of time, we're going to jump into Sheikh Jarrah 2021, because that's probably where a lot of y'all came from, I'm assuming. So 2021, at this point we were seeing almost every Ramadan escalations, mainly due to sort of instigation from, I hate doing this, right-wing Israeli groups, because they're all right-wing and pretty fash. So it's, I guess, the really fashy ones. We're instigating and basically, doing their fun marches, death to Arabs, all these fun things, right? Big instigation. It was Memorial Day. They didn't want the hand to go off. They didn't want the call to prayer to happen. So they actually cut the wires to the loudspeaker for the call to prayer. What else? We have the Death to Arabs March, which happens over and over again. We have instigations that happen at Al-Aqsa. Palestinians respond with demonstrations at Al-Aqsa to protect it. And they're basically met with more violence, more institutional violence by the state. They're attacked with rubber bullets, tear gas, so on and so forth. Hundreds of injuries are reported. And Palestinians still, though, continue to rally around Al-Aqsa. Almost simultaneously, this began in April and continued through May. Sheikh Jarrah started. Well, it didn't really start. It had been going on for years. It's a court system. But that's when the final ruling came out. It was basically going to displace 13 Palestinian families or 13 homes for a total of 58 people, including 17 children. there's a legal system that, it's a bunch of tomfoolery, I'm not gonna get into the details of it, between Jordan and Israel, they made agreements, the Palestinians were cut out of this deal. But basically, and then it's sort of also funded legally from a lot of Zionist American groups. A lot of the legal fees are paid for from here to essentially evict Palestinians legally under Israeli law. So Sheikh Jarrah picks up, as I said, 58 people are under threat of being evicted. Israeli settler groups begin marching in to Sheikh Jarrah, armed AR-15s, basically threatening the neighborhood. And then, once again, Palestinians rallied to protect Sheikh Jarrah. It became a sort of rally cry, and it became a global rally cry. I mean, I was in San Francisco at the time. We had 30,000 people in the street at one point. Out here, things were picking up everywhere around the world. Palestine was the talk. The photo, I'm sure most of y'all know who that is. That's Yaakov. I don't know if y'all know who Yaakov is. I'm sure you do. He did more for Palestine in like a 2-minute video than I've done in 33 years of living. He is my favorite Zionist by a mile. So thank you, Yaakov, for being an idiot and being on camera. Anyway. Sorry.
Don't leave people hanging. Tell them what you did if they don't know.
I don't have a video, but basically imagine a very attractive person in your backyard basically telling you that he has to take your house because if he doesn't, somebody else will. And you're like, but you don't. And he's like, but I do, because somebody's going to take it, so let it just be me. And this was obviously on video, this was very viral. And I think it really...
And he's from Brooklyn.
And yeah, he's also from Brooklyn. He's a big time Trump supporter, if you were wondering. Anyway, long story short, Hamas and other militant groups basically gave Israel an ultimatum to basically end the aggression and sort of the approach that they were taking with the peaceful demonstrators. They gave them till, I can't remember the date right now, it was, actually no, it was May 10th. May 10th at 6 p.m. They said cut it out or we're going to basically start a counteroffensive. They were desecrating the mosque, they were attacking peaceful protesters, people were being killed, there was lynchings, it was a mess. Hamas fired rockets, as we all know. 11 days of fighting commenced. By the end of it, 256 Palestinians were killed, 66 children, massive damage to infrastructure per usual. 40 schools were damaged, 4 hospitals, and 460 homes were demolished. I don't know if you remember Sheikh Jarrah. Like, I remember being like distraught at times about the numbers, right? Like you would, and it threw me off when I was making the slide. Like I had to like walk out of work for a second, but. I remember being distraught when it was 256 and 66 children, and we're at 30,000 right now. And like, I can't compute it. Like I'm still, it's not registering 100%. The significance of this moment was Palestinians rise up on all 4 fronts. And what I mean by that is they rose up in Gaza, they rose up in the West Bank, they rose up within the 48 borders, and in the diaspora. They were resisting everywhere. Old guard groups that disappeared, which I forgot to mention during Oslo. The one thing Oslo also did was it made Fatah the only legitimate Palestinian authority, the only legitimate representatives of Palestinians, and all other groups essentially terrorist organizations. So all these old guard groups went underground. And when Sheikh Jarrah popped off, they sort of just climbed out of the floor. It was very interesting to see, and they looked way better. They had nicer stuff. Like I was like, man, you guys have really been doing some stuff for the last 10 years. This is impressive. But Palestinian resistance groups we see an escalation in what they're capable of doing within the fighting. They start targeting infrastructure just like Israel targets infrastructure, and it becomes a little more tit for tat. And one of my favorite photos ever, and I should put on here, was just Netanyahu looking like disheveled after 11 days of not knowing how to deal with this. because the ground shifted. In 2021, the earth changed. The ground we were fighting on was no longer the same ground, and they knew it. Last thing, Sheikh Jarrah ruling was overturned. And the Palestinian groups, for the first time in a long time, essentially become a coalition. They start working together, they started planning things together. So much so, Israel has this really fun thing that they do where when they request for a ceasefire, or when a ceasefire is requested, they will bomb as heavy as they possibly can up until the last moment. The coalition was able to do, the coalition was able to essentially put so much pressure on Netanyahu and his regime that when the ceasefire was called, they told them if one bomb is dropped within 3 hours of the ceasefire is off, we continue this fight. They did not drop another bomb.
There you go.
So that brings us to the present day. And the events that took place on October 7th were in response to Israeli violations, such as the ongoing and expanding occupation, Israeli settler violence, which results in the destruction of Palestinian-owned property, or Palestinian deaths, or both. So on this day, the armed resistance group known as Izad Din al-Qassam Brigade and other allies take 52 hostages as bargaining chips for the thousands of captured Palestinians in Israeli prisons. Keep in mind, these hostages range in age, no reason for their capture. And on October 7th, during the mission, there was, of course, it resulted in fighting, and Israel instructed its forces to prevent the capture of its people by any means necessary. So Israel opened fire, specifically tank shells, on the resistance fighting groups and Israeli civilians. Israel then provides faulty reports regarding the casualties. They listed 40 decapitated babies and made claims on mass rape, which both have been debunked. They also reported 1,400 deaths before they revised the number down to 1,200 because they realized those bodies belonged to the resistance fighters. After opening fire, they couldn't tell the difference between their own civilians and those resisting. And Israel begins their indiscriminate bombing campaign, committing genocide in Palestine. And before I read off these numbers, I want us to think about how many martyrs lie within these numbers, and how many stories we won't hear. And thankfully we'll hear some, as long as we continue to uplift and listen to Palestinian voices. There have been 30,000 civilians murdered, 70% of which are women and children, and of course we're still mourning the death of Palestinian men. 117 journalists and media workers have been assassinated. This is a form of censorship as well as genocide. 2.4 million have been internally displaced, and Israel perpetuates a humanitarian crisis. There is a famine happening in Gaza. They've cut off access to food, water, electricity, fuel. They won't let humanitarian aid trucks come in. I'm sure we all saw that video recently of protesters happily marching and singing, and it's absurd. So Israel is attempting to harm the Palestinian body and mind, but we can all see that the Palestinian soul remains strong. And Palestinian resistance is creating revolutionary waves. As they continue to rally for their community, we see civil defense workers working tirelessly to put out fires, pull out whoever they can from the rubble. We see journalists risking their lives to share the truth with the world. Medical professionals working in hospitals that are not functioning with little to no resources, providing services to people in dire need, children in dire need. And this is inspiring political solidarity actions from Yemen, who is blocking shipments to Israel on the condition that they cease fire. Yes. Also South Africa, who has filed a case against Israel. Yeah, let's give it up for South Africa. Also Chile, Mexico, Cuba, Switzerland have also filed claims against Israel in the International Court of Justice. China and Malaysia have also demanded for Palestinian statehood at the UN. And not only are we seeing this politically, but within countries where imperialism does reign, such as here, we're seeing demonstrations led by the people demanding the liberation of Palestine. And that's all what we're doing here, so please give it up for yourselves as well. We're educating ourselves, we're organizing and mobilizing for Palestine. And not only are we raising awareness for Palestine, but we're also raising awareness for other nations under imperialist threat, such as Syria, Yemen, Sudan, and Congo. We're fighting for the liberation of all, because no one is free until we all are free.